a good perspective on the way you should view history in the context of what we're seeing now with Brett Kavanaugh. Because there have been in this country, obviously, more than two sort of irreconcilable, at least to this point, perspectives on how our democracy should work. There have been other perspectives, and two major ones, but which is not to say that there aren't, strongly a third or fourth, perhaps, one being more democratic and socialistic, and the other being more authoritarian and fascistic. But two major forces that have run through our history, and they really, in many respects, there's an ebb and flow to where they, how strong they are in terms of identifying with their core brand proposition, as it were. But they have never gone away. And I think when you hear the conversation I had with Carol Anderson about what voting rights were like following the Civil War and following really Reconstruction, and you're going to see some parallels between 150 years ago and today, 130 years ago, I guess. And we're also going to enter an era now with Kavanaugh where we're going to see some things that are parallel from the first 25 years of the 20th century. Really, I guess a 40-year period, maybe from 1890 to maybe 50 years to 37, which is known as the Lochner era. We have talked about it in this on this program in various times. You can go back and listen to some of the Ian Millhiser conversations we've had. But it was a period when the Supreme Court regularly struck down economic regulations. In addition to upholding a lot of laws that disenfranchised voters. So basically, attack the rights of minorities and of poor people and enhance the rights of corporations. That is the sort of 101 version of what the Lochner era is, and we are about to enter a new Lochner era. The only upside that I can say to this, and it's one of these things where I don't even want to say it's a silver lining around a cloud. Try and stay positive in these situations, but there is no calculation whatsoever where this isn't a massive net negative. Not to mention, Kavanaugh is a guy who I think is driven by the most hyper-partisan ideological find a result and then reverse engineer how you're going to argue to get there type of judge who's going in with apparently quite a chip on his shoulder, not to mention a series of lies that he told to the committee. I mean, we just had the day after the vote, Chief Justice John Roberts received more than a dozen judicial misconduct complaints against Brett Kavanaugh, which a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals of the D.C. Circuit, because Merrick Garland, who is the Chief Justice of that court, I don't think that's what they call it, but the head judge of that court, recused himself for obvious reasons and handed over to Karen LaCraft Henderson. She dismissed some of the complaints against Kavanaugh as being frivolous. Others, she said, warranted serious consideration. They were based upon lies that he told during his hearings. So the guy is, best case scenario, a proven liar and an obvious liar. He obviously, and beyond that, people make their own assessment. Here is Susan Collins. Now, look, here's the deal. People were saying, why is Susan Collins getting so much grief about this vote, as opposed to, say, the other 50 people, mostly men, who voted for for Kavanaugh? Why not Joe Manchin to start with? Joe Manchin's a Democrat, at least nominally. He's a horrible Democrat from a red state. Joe Manchin, if Susan Collins does not vote for Brett Kavanaugh, Joe Manchin also does not vote for Brett Kavanaugh. That is the reality. There would have been no space for him to do it. He would have never been the deciding vote. It's still not helpful to have him vote for Brett Kavanaugh. It's indicative of, in many respects, what a corrupt guy he is. But that's the reality of the situation. There's a reason why they timed it all the way they did. There's a reason why Manchin waited for Collins to announce before he announced, because he had to make sure that she was actually going to do what she said she was going to do when they were meeting all together. And they had a sense of where they were all meeting. And by all of them, I mean Flake and Murkowski and Manchin. That's why Manchin announced after Collins. Because that is how his vote was contingent upon her vote. And the reason why Susan Collins gets more grief than the rest of the Republicans who voted for Kavanaugh is because she has branded herself in a specific way as a protector of women's rights, even though she's a Republican. She has branded herself as a so-called moderate. And then she went on the floor of the Senate and basically argued just about everything you could without bringing up Pizzagate. She is not a moderate. She may be slightly less strident when she speaks, but that's not the point of being a moderate in the Senate. She votes with Trump consistently, and then she goes on CNN and tries to sell this garbage.
Do you still think it is possible that he did it? You just don't have the proof to back that up?
I do not believe that Brett Kavanaugh was her assailant.
So
I do believe that she was assaulted. I don't know by whom, and I'm not certain when, but I do not believe that he was the assailant.
And so people watching you, hearing you say that, you understand that they'll think that you're saying you don't believe her, that she, I know you say that she believes that he was, but maybe she was wrong. But if she said that under oath and he said that under oath, you made a decision that he said is more valid than what she said.
In this country, we have a presumption.
All right, pause it for a second. Okay, she doesn't want to answer that question because the answer is obvious. But also note that she can't just decide that Blasey Ford was accurate in the fact that something happened to her. She doesn't know who did it, though. She doesn't believe her about who did it. But what she's also not saying is that I also don't believe that she must have made up or imagined Mark Judge being there. And she must have made up or imagined the existence of PJ and her close friend who was there at the party. Like, how nuts does Susan Collins have to believe that Blasey Ford is to say this? I mean, it's one thing to say, I'm going to have a completely unreasonable standard in which to reject this guy's application for the highest court in the land for a lifetime appointment. It's one thing to say that. I'm going to have a standard that's actually even higher than it would be in a civil court. This isn't court. But it goes criminal standard, civil standard. If you were going to sue for wrongful, for harm or something, I mean, there's a lawsuit that she could file. That standard is not beyond a reasonable doubt. And this isn't even a civil court proceeding. This isn't even a magistrate proceeding. This is a job interview. This is, we're going to sign off on you being hired for a lifetime appointment. But she makes up a standard and then pretends. This is how craven Susan Collins is. Continue.
We have a presumption of innocence. And as a matter of fairness, what I decided to use as a standard was the question of, is it more likely than not that Brett Kavanaugh assaulted Christine Ford? And there was no corroborating evidence that he did so. Each of the people...
Pause it. Well, but there was corroborating evidence, and everybody knows it. The fact that Blasey Ford had told her therapist 6 years ago, that Kavanaugh had done it was corroborating evidence. The fact that Kavanaugh was a blackout drunk, and there was plenty of corroborating evidence to the idea that he was lying about that.
Like you said, the calendar with the names.
And somehow Blasey Ford got it down to almost the week that he was at a party with those same people. But she doesn't have the ability to know who assaulted her. I mean, this is absurd. It's absurd. It's embarrassing that she actually goes on television to try and push this stuff. But Susan Collins made a decision the other day. And Lindsey Graham made this decision a couple of weeks ago. McCain is gone. They have lost the cover of there being some other sort of like third way in the Republican Party. And their future lies in basically becoming Louis Gohmert. Just a little bit, more polite. And now, I don't know how much they've raised now that will go to Susan Collins. It's over with $3.5 million now?
Yeah. They crashed the website within a half an hour of that
But this is
indulgent, disgusting speech of hers.
This is why Susan Collins deserves to be hit on this. It's not like she just made the vote and walked away. She is trying to sell it. She is her job, and she will get paid for it. She will get paid in support like we've never seen for Susan Collins from the Republican Party. Her job was to go out there and sell this to Republican women and muddy the waters and be the shill for the Republican Party. That's what her job is. It's Orrin Hatch's job to dismiss the women with a wave, and Chuck Grassley to say women are too busy to be on the Judiciary Committee. Did you not hear that?
Yeah.
We have it on the sound list? You should grab it. Play that later in the fun half. Chuck Grassley overheard saying the reason why there are no Republican women on the Judiciary Committee is it's too much work for them. So this is where we are. And you can... The importance of this midterm election is obviously huge. And there is still a path to the Senate. It is, very difficult, but we are a month away from the election. I use Heidi Heitkamp as just as an example. The people who are motivated to vote for Heidi Heitkamp by this process are going to be just as motivated on November 8th as they were yesterday. The people who were activated in defense of Brett Kavanaugh and against the feminazis who would in some way endanger a potentially great man's opportunity to become a great man, they will not be as motivated. And so it's not just enough to vote, but go out and knock on some doors, tell your friends to vote, vote early. Taking the Senate is pretty crucial at this point. It's going to be much harder because a lot of the reason why the House is much easier at this point is because those districts where there are basically Republican women in the suburbs who are probably going to stay home, those tend to be the swing districts. And so those are the low-hanging fruits. But when you have red states, I think there are 10 states where you have Democratic senators running, or 10 Democratic senators running in red states. Much harder. So go out, organize. And the next step is going to be to talk about reform of the Supreme Court. And people are also talking about reform of the Senate. That's long overdue. We should say the Senate originally, I hope people know, was not elected by the people in the state. It was elected by the state legislatures. They were chosen, essentially, right? I mean, there was an election, but I have a feeling it probably wasn't terribly contested for those first 100 years. More or less.
Do you think statehood would be a good first step as far as that goes?
For D.C. and Puerto Rico, without a doubt. It's absurd. It's absurd. But that is a step one in terms of reformation of the Senate. Getting rid of the Electoral College. More democratic reforms. But I also think that pushing for court packing, I've stated this before, in my opinion, term limits on the court will be more durable, but push for court packing by all means. Because if that is a legitimate threat on the table, then a term limit is much more likely. And there should also be, to that end, get a commitment from your representatives to hold hearings on Brett Kavanaugh, whether he lied. And certainly Brett Kavanaugh should want that, to clear his name, to get out from under this cloud, to show all of those Clintonites who ginned up all of these claims against him that he didn't lie. Go through the Manny Miranda stuff when he received stolen information 12 years ago. Go through the questions of his drinking. Go through the documents that the Bush administration has. We're going to see some of those. They're going to be FOIA'd soon. All of this should be revisited. There is no other path. There is no other path, folks.